Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And today we're going to be talking all about sidechaining, the why to do it, the how to do it, all of that good stuff. And it's going to be a response to an audience question. I got a request to do an episode all about sidechaining. Why should you do it? How should you do it? Where should you do it? We're going to go into all of that and a lot more. If you want to ask me questions, by the way, you can do it. You can type right in down below if you're on the YouTube or Facebook video versions of this. Or if you're listening to an audio-only version of the podcast, just shoot me an email, podcast@sonicscoop.com. Love to take listener questions when I can, so definitely hit me up there. All right, sidechaining. I've actually covered this before in Sonic Scoop. I had a popular article years back that was just written about sidechaining. I even did a demonstration video on some sidechaining concepts that I'll link to in the show notes down below. But for today, in this talky format of podcast, the best thing to do is to give you just an overall view of how these things work, all the different places you might use this technique of sidechaining, and just also the what is it for those of you who don't even know what sidechaining really is. I think we're going to make this really simple so you can play around with this stuff on your own, have better results, and some cool new tricks up your sleeve. Before we get into it, the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors, the most important one being you. How do you sponsor? By hitting the like button if you're on the YouTubes or the Facebooks. And remember to subscribe and hit the notifications bell, all that good stuff. Make sure you don't miss other episodes of the podcast. Also, if you want to leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, subscribe on Spotify, all that stuff super duper helps. Big shout out. Speaking of helps, if you want to help your mixing, check out Sound Toys. Been sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. Try out anything they make for 30 days for free over at soundtoys.com. Some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Also, big shout out and thanks to Focusrite, making the lovely Focusrite Claret interface that I'm speaking to right now. They make some of the best bang for the buck stuff, from the entry-level Scarlett line all the way up to the high-end RedNet series. If you want to go deeper with me, last shameless plug before we get into the meat of it, I've got full-length courses. You can check out Mastering Demystified over at masteringdemystified.com, where I tell you literally everything I know about mastering and give you a roadmap that's going to set you up for success in your own masters. Speaking of a roadmap, you want mixing? I got Mixing Breakthroughs. Check out the full-length version at mixingbreakthroughs.com. All right, let's get right into it. Sidechaining. What is it? Why do it? What are the cool tricks? All right, the what is it? The easiest way to think about sidechaining is with a compressor. There's other places sidechaining can be used, but let's think about it with a compressor real quick. When you put a compressor across a vocal, let's say, that compressor is compressing your vocal, and it's responding to the vocal, right? You're putting a vocal into it, so it's going to listen to the vocal. When the vocal gets really loud, it'll compress it. When it's not so loud, it won't compress it, and it's compressing the vocal. A sidechain is a different idea. What if instead of that compressor listening to the vocal, it listened to something else? Why would you want to do that? All right, let's think of another example. This is going to be the most obvious case example and kind of where sidechaining first came from. Imagine you're doing something really exciting, like making a nature documentary. That's supposed to be not exciting to people in music, but actually, nature documentaries are kind of badass. If you've never watched like the Planet Earth series from BBC, my goodness, there's a lot of stuff going on in nature, man. Nature is probably more exciting than all of our lives, so I shouldn't use that as an example of something boring. But say you're doing a nature documentary and you have this bed of music going on. And then the narrator comes on. And as soon as the narrator starts speaking, you want the music to dip down. Well, obviously you can do that in an automated way. You go in there in Pro Tools or whatever your DAW is and, do some automation on the music bed to bring it down. But back in the Dizzy, that's not how it was done necessarily. Often enough, you'd have a sidechain where you have this music bed. And once someone starts speaking, the compressor essentially on this music bed is going to turn down the music really hard and for quite a long time, a long release time, but only when someone starts speaking. So it's kind of like an automatic volume ride, an automatic assistant mixer, right? So instead of compressing this music bed based on the music, you're compressing it now based on the voiceover. So the voiceover comes in and turns down the music bed. That's the idea of sidechaining. You're compressing one thing, but listening to the input of something else. Well, there's a lot of creative ways this can be used in music as well. And it can also be a little bit more nuanced than just listening to something else. You could have your compressor, say, listen to an EQ'd version of your signal. We'll get into that more in a minute, but first, we're going to go into one of the applications of sidechaining that is the most talked about. And this is like ducking pads based on a kick drum, or ducking bass based on a kick drum, or say ducking guitars based off of a snare. So here's an idea for you. You've got one big bass note sound each measure that's like the whole measure. It hits on the downbeat and just goes the entire measure until it switches to a new note. But on top of that, there's this punchy little kick drum pattern. And you're having a hard time having that kick drum speak through that bass. Well, you can compress the bass very quickly and very briefly only when the kick drum is hitting. That's the idea where sidechaining is used in music production. And this is one of the most commonly referenced sidechain tricks. But you can take that idea and apply it to other things. It might not be a bass. It might be a synth pad or some strings that the kick is now going to cut through. But it doesn't have to be a kick drum. You can take a snare track and have that cut through the pad, or have that cut through some guitars. Or you can have a guitar track and have that bring down your synths, bring down your keyboard. So now when the guitar is doing its thing, those elements duck down. And there are a couple ways to do this. I mean, you can do it in the long, drawn-out, slow release time way that, back in the day they might have done with narration turning down a music bed. But more likely, it's being done in a shorter release, really fast attack kind of way, where just the initial impact of that sidechained element is turning down your other element. So that is big use case number one for sidechaining in music, punching little holes into other elements in the mix to get a new one to stick through. Now, there's potential problems with this approach because if overdone, it can give you almost like this seasick kind of sound where every time the kick hits and it's pulling down all the other drums or pulling down all of your synths. And there's almost like this kind of like weird heaving sound to it if overdone. But even that can be cool. Some people overdo it on purpose, and that's not wrong. Sometimes overdoing things is fun. But there's other ways to use sidechaining as well. And I think one of the other most common ways is to use sidechaining on a mix bus or master bus or submix compressor, where instead of, say, a mix bus compressor reacting to the full mix, it's reacting to an EQ'd version of the mix. So every time your kick drum hits, the compressor isn't just sucking down on that. In fact, it might not even react to the kick drum at all. And you can do that by sending an EQ'd version of the signal you want to compress to the sidechain input of the compressor. Perhaps a EQ'd version that takes away all the low ends. So now the bass and the kick aren't triggering the compressor anymore, or aren't triggering it as hard. And that's another common application. Some people will even go further and they'll want to have the sidechain boost some of the high mids or some of the treble. So the compressor is actually reacting even more to the mid-range and the kind of more detailed frequencies and not reacting practically at all to the low end. So that's another way to use these kinds of tools. Now you can also do this kind of stuff totally in reverse. You don't have to just sidechain compressors. You could sidechain a gate so that, let's say, you have a synthesizer pad, but it only comes in on the kick drum hits, or it only gets triggered on the snare hits. And this was actually a trick that people did, again, back in the day, say, kind of earlier, hip-hop production, the days before sample replacement was so popular. You might take a sine wave in the key of the song, say really deep low F or E or whatever the key of the song is. And now every time the kick drum hits, there's a gate that opens up and plays that low sine wave, but only when the kick is hitting, adding some subharmonic reinforcement to it. You can do this with anything. You can turn on a pad, but only when the attacky initial portions of an arpeggiated guitar are coming in. You could be super creative with this stuff. So side chains can work not only to compress things and suck them down, but to open them up so that things open up based on some other stimulus. Another idea around sidechaining is a de-esser is basically just a limiter with an EQ-based sidechain, where this super fast limiter is only tamping down on specific frequencies. Because although it might be compressing the entire signal if it's working in a broadband way, it's only doing that when an EQ'd sidechain signal tells it to. De-essers, of course, can be even more complicated than that. They can also be frequency specific, where they're only limiting a certain area. And then you take that idea to the next level and you end up with dynamic EQs and multiband compressors. And sidechaining is part of what's going on under the hood of those very complex tools. Now, an easy question to answer: how do you do it? Well, so many compressors, limiters, gates, expanders have sidechain inputs built right into them. They might even often have a sidechain EQ filter built right into them. If you want to do those kinds of EQing tricks where, say, a mix bus compressor is only reacting to upper frequencies and not low frequencies, those kinds of EQ filters could be built right in. You at the very least need to be working with some type of compressor, limiter, expander, gate, dynamic plugin or piece of hardware that at least has a sidechain input. And it's usually very, very easy to do this in your DAW. There'll often be like a little key icon, and you just set it to either a specific bus. So say bus number 1 will now be the sidechain input for that compressor. And anything you send to bus number 1 is what's triggering that compressor instead of the track that you're putting that compressor on. But a lot of modern DAWs and plugins go further than that, where you can just go in and pick some track, You just go in there to the sidechain input, select kick drum, and now your kick drum track is the sidechain input on your compressor. And as mentioned, some will be even more sophisticated than that with EQ curves built in. If you have a favorite compressor that doesn't have an EQ curve built in, you can do this in much the same way. Again, you'd set the sidechain input of your compressor to, say, bus 1, and now everything you route to bus 1 is going to end up being what's triggering that compressor, but now you just EQ bus 1. So you create your own EQ filter going into your compressor. That's probably something where it would be helpful to have a visual aid. So I do have a version of this where I did on the B&H channel way back, where I did a 3-part series on advanced compression techniques, where you can really see and hear parallel compression, sidechain compression, and serial compression. I'll link to that in the show notes down below. But this is a podcast. It's a talking format. Every once in a while, people will comment on the podcast. They'll say, "What do you talk so much, bro? All you do is talk." To which I'm like, it's a podcast. What do you want me to do? Dance? I also think that if it's a podcast, most people are just listening in this format. It doesn't make sense for me to crack open the DAW. But if you do want to crack open the DAW, see and hear some of these audio examples, check out the show notes down below. I'll link you right to that sidechain compression video I did a few years back for the YouTubes. In the meantime, thanks for hanging out with me. If you want to go even deeper, I got some free stuff for you. You can get the 5 habits of every great mixer over at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. Totally free workshop that gives you an insight into the way that all of the top mixers work, the habits that they all have in common, the things that they do on every single mix. You got to get it, sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. Totally free. I think about 40-minute workshop on that idea. Also, you can get a free workshop on mastering, a primer to mastering called Mastering 101. Check that out, sonicscoop.com/mastering 101 for something else that's totally free. If you want to go even deeper on the premium level, you can check out our full-length courses, Mastering Demystified at masteringdemystified.com and Mixing Breakthroughs over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. Big shout out and thanks to you for hitting that like button, commenting, subscribing, doing all that good stuff. Also, leaving ratings and reviews on the Apple Podcasts, on the Spotify is super duper helpful. And big thanks to Sound Toys sponsoring this podcast from the beginning. Try out any of the creative mixing effects they make for free for 30 days at soundtoys.com. Also, big shout out and thanks to Focusrite making the lovely Claret interface I'm speaking into at this very moment. Definitely check out their stuff if you're in the market for an interface. They make some of the best affordable stuff, mid-range stuff, and high-end stuff out there. Really great bang for the buck stuff. Also, in case you're interested, I'm talking to a new microphone from Jay-Z. They're not sponsoring the podcast, but I'll shout them out anyway because I'm going to do an in-depth look at this one, the BB29. Let me know how you like this one. Should this become my new mic for the podcast? You let me know in the comments down below. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. See you next time.